Howdy, this is Northwest Resilience, and I'm Nathan Donnelly. I wanted to do a kind of a backstory recap video of Season 3 for Alone, Season 6 for Alone, Episode 3. I was on Season 6, and I have really been enjoying how the season is progressing. It's been really fascinating to me to watch all these other people who I spent weeks with before going out, seeing how they did, and then seeing how my own edit has come up. Episode 3 is kind of a big one for me. It nearly took me out while I was out there and around the 15-day mark, and so I wanted to go into it and kind of give as in-depth a backstory and review as I can of each of the episodes. I want to tell you guys kind of what goes through my mind as somebody who went in, looked at the show as a person who was going to get on the show, intended to get on the show, and then once I did realize I was getting to get on, I watched all of the seasons again and really picked apart every little thing for just those little things that realize make a big difference when you're out in alone, the survival situation. Episode 3 starts out with Jordan coming in, hiking into his camp, pulling off of obviously fully loaded backpack and just pulling one rabbit after another out of it. And he ended up catching 4 rabbits in his traps, in his snares all around wherever he had his camp set up. So again, I mentioned in the episode 2 recap that I thought Jordan was going to be pretty good at trapping. I've seen him build traps at boot camp. I know he did it extensively in Siberia in a similar climate, and bam, 4 rabbit day. I think he in that one day caught more food than anybody has ever caught in the history of the show, and kept going with some momentum. So Jordan then goes on and talks about how abundant he thinks that area is, and how maybe it's not such a bad thing to be in an old burn. And I talked about that in a little bit in my previous video for episode 2, but I was really jealous of the fact that he got put in the old burn, because it was 4-year-old burn, and that means there's 4 years of brand new lush green growth to grow up as forage for large game animals, for rabbits, for anybody and everybody who eats vegetation out there. So not to mention the firewood resources, the nice standing dry killed wood, and there are drawbacks to being in an old burn. You're not going to get as much cover from the weather with some big thick trees. That forest type isn't really that thick or wind breaking in the first place, but he was pretty dismayed when he got dropped off there, and I think he realized that it was probably the biggest strength of the area where he was. He goes on to talk about, it's an abundant place, and if the weather was a little nicer, he'd maybe want to bring the family there, and kind of joking about that. And then he starts talking about, what the forest life is like, what he would want to do with his family, and he has kind of a similar talk than Nikki does in episode 2 about, he calls it the forest life, but about living a life where you're living by your own wits, your own know-how and knowledge, and Jordan's one of those guys who can do that. He proves it with his 4 rabbits. He proves it with his discipline, and he does. And there's a level of freedom that comes from realizing that the only limitation on you is you. That's a pretty cool thing. It's maybe very frightening as well, but freedom isn't supposed to be safe necessarily, and I think that people who value it and go after it value it more than safety. I don't think that it's any less safe than clamoring after safety, because I don't think that is safe either. But Jordan's a neat guy. I like that philosophy that he comes out with, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that plays out through the show. Next, Wonia comes out. We finally get to be introduced to Wonia. She is a super neat person. I really connected with her well in boot camp, and I'm super stoked to see how she progresses through the season. She's incredibly skilled. She has been teaching these skills for over 20 years. Wears the clothing, makes her own clothing and wears it day in, day out. None of this is theory for Juanita. She's living it already, and that is a tremendous strength. I got to hand it to her. I think she's an amazing person. She is humble, but she also speaks and operates from a place of confidence. None of this stuff is theory to her, and I'm pretty impressed by her so far. She is, she says herself, that it's a lifestyle for her. It's not a hobby. I also noticed right off the bat, the shelter she starts whipping out is pretty darn solid. She's really good with that saw. She's really good with engineering things with her brain, and she's got a tight, solid, what looks to be going to be a really wind firm shelter, and it's sited really well. The old saying that a good shelter in a bad location is a bad shelter. She's going to have a great shelter in a great location because she nestled herself back into some good trees. She's going to have some good cover from the wind, and the only drawback of that is maybe you're not going to get quite so much sun. But when sun's really only up in the air 5 hours of the day and it's coming at such a steep angle, there's no power to it anyway, maybe that's not such a big deal. So I'm looking to see her shelter scene be pretty excellent, particularly as things get gnarly. She did something I've never heard of before while she was building that shelter, which she did certain walls of her shelter were double walled. So she did a row of logs on the outside, a row of logs on the inside, and then she stuffed the bit in between with boughs or moss or I'm not sure what to make an insulative layer, just like your house is built, and to make it windproof. The interior logs she actually peels all the bark off of. She's basically turned her saw into a draw knife by sharpening the exposed back edge of the saw, and peels her poles with it really effectively. I was very impressed with that. That makes the poles really bright colored. So here is bark, here is a peeled pole. You can see how much darker this is to this, and the interior of her shelter is just going to be that much more comfortable because of it. If any of you can remember Callie's shelter in season 3, Callie took her own tarp as one of her 10 items that season, and she had custom made a super heavy duty bright white tarp. And the inside of that thing was beautiful. I mean, she did her own beauty artwork to it in addition to that, but the lighting was incredible. I would recommend to the Alone producers, rather than giving us these sickly green tarps, if they want good camera work to take place inside of the shelter, give the contestants white tarps. It's going to make the television better for it. But yeah, I thought that was really brilliant, peeling the poles. And then she finishes it with a self high five, which is also something new to me. I'd never seen that before. She's pretty hilarious. Then I come in, and I'm laying in my sleeping bag on the floor in my shelter, and talking about a dream that I just had. Pardon the smoke there. The fire's doing what it wants to. I did have a dream. I had this dream out there for quite a while before I woke up. There's this massive black bull out in a pasture that had my fishnet spread on the ground out in the pasture. And this bull had its horns and its legs all caught on my fishnet. And it was just tearing at it. It couldn't get loose. And I remember in my dream kind of going out there and trying to get the net free of the bull because otherwise it was going to ruin the net. And then I woke up. I woke up being like, I got to check my fishnet. Something is going on out there. And I went out there, and the edit makes it look like I went out there and there was a fish in the net. That was probably a day or two later. When I went out there, there was not a fish in the net, but my net was tangled all crazy. Something definitely got in the net and even looped it over the top of the arm pole that I had it hanging off of. It had struggled in that net for a good long time, and maybe I was picking up that on my dreams or something like that, but I ended up having to pull the net, straighten it all out so it would hang properly again. I think that might have even been the time that I after I initially deployed the net, I caught 1 or 2 fish in it, and then I tied small stones, maybe the size of this fir cone here, to it, and made it so that the net would drape a little more downward, but not have so much weight in it that if a fish caught in it, it would keep the net from wrapping well. So so that was a little bit of a skew in the editing, but not a big deal at all. So then I did come out, maybe a day or two later, and sure enough, there was another nice fish in it, and they finally give a good shot of my fish next to my axe. And I had measured my axe handle out. It's 29. My whole axe is 29.5 inches long, and I still have it here. And I put inch increment marks all on it with a permanent marker before I went out there. And that female lake trout, which was an inch or two smaller than the big male I had caught a week or two previous, was exactly the length from the inside fork of her tail to the tip of her nose as my axe. So that was 29.5 inch long fish. At that point in my life, the second largest fish I'd ever caught in my life, next to the one I just caught previous to that. It was another lake trout. Holy moly, those fish are amazing. They are just so fatty and so calorie intensive compared to other fish I ate out there. I feel like they had 3 times the energy in them because they were so fatty. This was also a gravid female, meaning she had eggs in her. It was the time of year when they are going to be spawning, and the male that I caught had semen in him. He was ready to spawn. She was ready to spawn. It was just that time of year. And I, let's see here. I have a little bit of background in fisheries, and I knew that she was a female before I ever got out of the water, and I was thinking about those eggs. The flesh of a lake trout and the eggs of a lake trout are this amazing, deep, golden egg yolk color. Like if you've ever bought free-range eggs off of a farm or raised them in your own yard, there's a difference between the egg yolk from that egg and then the one that you get from, the Mega Mart that eggs are 2 years old or 2 weeks old or something like that. There's light emanating out of it, and the eggs that I got out of this thing were like that. They were just fresh and perfect and screaming with life and energy, and I wanted to eat them. I had like a little Ziploc baggie that I had come across out there, and cleaned it out, and knew that it was clean, and placed it in a way so that I could squeeze the belly of the fish and all of her eggs would come out into that bag. And I collected like a whole sandwich baggie full of eggs out of her that way, and when I gutted her I got more, but they were all bloody. And they were coming out of a freshly killed fish. I actually didn't kill her. She was dead when I came to her in the net. I think she was maybe the only fish that actually was dead when I found her, and that's because the net had closed down over her gills and closed them off against her head, so she couldn't breathe. All the other fish I caught, I think, were still alive when I caught them. But I had checked the net just the previous afternoon, so she wasn't in there. I probably caught her in the night, and she was probably in there for a few hours at the most before she had deceased, half a day. So things were fresh. The water was like 33 degrees on the edge of freezing, so it was colder than your refrigerator at home. I felt totally comfortable with eating raw fish eggs. I eat them every time I go have sushi. They're in caviar. That's what caviar is. It's a pretty safe thing to eat. And so I had them in my clean bag. My hands looked super grungy and dirty, but that's because I had just cut her open on a rock that had black lichen on it. So the black bits on my hands were actually lichen, which is another thing that's pretty much sterile because it's very acidic. And after thinking about it, and the more I think about it, the less likely I think it is that I actually got food poisoning from eating those eggs. And what I think actually happened is that my body was just kind of in shock and eating this super rich food. I had eaten that one male fish most of my way through that. but it was smoked and dried by that time, and it was not these. I've never eaten anything like those eggs before. There's no richer food I've ever put in my body in my life. And I started reacting to it probably within 45 minutes. I gutted her, had just that little bit. Pretty much all the fish that I ate, all the eggs that I ate, you pretty much saw me do it on camera. They didn't edit any of that out. Put some eggs on the hooks that I had already deployed out there. There's one site where they show me with my bright red hook with 3 eggs on it. I had been still fishing unsuccessfully. Barbless hooks just don't work for that. Even if you catch a fish, they're going to get off, if they're out there for more than a few minutes. So I hiked back to camp with my prize and expecting to get in on filleting her and starting the whole drying process. And about the time I sit down in my shelter, I realize I am really winding down. I'm feeling very run down. Something is not right. Not feeling sick yet, but just like somebody turned the lights off. And sit there for probably 5, 10, 15 minutes, and I start to get nauseous and move down on my sleeping bag, trying to get prone and just see if anything, and I'm getting more and more nauseous. And I think what happens, my body was kind of I don't know if shock is the right term, but it was just not used to this particular food type and was rejecting it. Again, like I said about Cryptosporidium and Giardia when I was talking about Donnie's incident with the muskrat, which I don't think made him sick. At least not the cooked portions of it. I just think that something was kind of a shock to my system, and it needed to move it out. So by that point, though, it had already gone into my, past my stomach and was in my digestive system. And I went outside and I dry heaved hard for 3 hours. They didn't really capture the length and the depth to which I was puking my guts out in front of my shelter there, but in reality, I only puked up about 5 or 6 of those little eggs, and the rest was me just dry heaving in awful gut-wrenching pain. And I threw my back out. I actually was dry heaving that hard that I threw my back out. It was awful, and I was to the point to where if it was going to continue on that way into the night, I was going to tap out. I honestly thought I might not survive the night if whatever was going on with me continued to go on until morning. And I had resigned myself to the fact that if it doesn't get better before dark, I have to leave here. This was day 15 only. I had months, stored up inside of me to get out of me to be out there. And the idea of leaving. Not an option at all. Never was out there for me. And man, though, I would have tapped that night if I felt that way when the darkness had fallen, because I was genuinely worried I wouldn't make it till morning. So that's how bad that episode was. I know they weren't able to capture it all that well, but it took me out for 3 whole days. The next day I was able to carve a spoon and get that fish butchered up, but I didn't do anything else for 3 days. My back was killing me, and I had zero energy at all. That really knocked me down. It was a pretty big event for me, and right around day 15 was an interesting time for a couple of reasons. One of which, my road to Alone is pretty long. I helped a good friend who was on season 3 in Patagonia. We trained together for a number of months to get her ready for her season, and that's when I applied for the season that I eventually got on. Season 2 was still airing when I applied, and I got on season 6. So there was a lot of buildup. It was pretty subtle, but in the meantime, I had been considered for another show that the production company was thinking about doing, and almost got on that show, except they never did shoot it. And then that show got canceled just as they were casting for season 6. I wasn't eligible for season 4 because that was doubles, and I wasn't eligible for season 5 because that was returners. So actually, the very first moment that I was eligible for a show was right when that show got canceled and season 6 was being cast for. I ended up being pretty much the first person who was in consideration for going to boot camp, and then accepted onto the show. I think in like early September, the year before we went out there, and then I was full on alone all the time, training myself to use my axe really well, gaining fat, fasting all the time, or not all the time, but fasting like a day a week to get to shake hands with hunger again, to train my mind, to gain all the weight I gained for the show. I gained nearly 30 pounds to go out there, as much as I possibly could, while simultaneously losing muscle mass to lower my metabolism. I'm a fairly big, strong guy. I'm not too worried about being strong enough to do anything. You know, Nia talks about that a little bit in her introduction. Survival isn't about isn't about brute force. It's about using this thing properly and having a good relationship with the land. And I'm not worried about, being able to swing a 2 1/4 pound axe, 2 3/4 pound axe. It's not a big deal. So I dropped muscle mass to lower my metabolism. I did a lot in that period of time. I stopped listening to media. I didn't listen to the radio for at least 6 months, whole months before going out there, because I didn't want my mind used to having some chatter in the background going all the time, because it's not what I was going to have out there. I gave up watching TV when I was 19, so I cleaned myself out. I detoxed myself of all the media and stuff that is in the modern world, to train my mind for being out there. That was, I can't remember where I got off topic there, but that was a long road to being on alone, and it took till about day 15 for me to let that go. I didn't realize how much that had built up. I've talked to other people, and they talk about being under a lot of pressure. Kind of Donnie touches on it a little bit. He's a father of 2 children, and his wife he's got to worry about back home. Thinking of him as a superhero, and I didn't have that, thankfully. My girlfriend was ultra supportive, but wasn't telling me don't come home until you win or anything like that. I didn't have that kind of pressure, but I had this other, more subtle, slow building pressure that I didn't realize was there, and it took 2+ weeks to drop it. And I think that whole catharsis of me dry heaving so hard for so long was a big part of the physical representation of me letting that go. While I was out at the gill net, they're cleaning the fish initially. That's the first shot you see of this little cedar board that comes into play later on in the season that I found washed up on the beach. It's just a little piece of cedar fencing. Ended up becoming very important. In that season, it was really important, or in that episode, it was really important because I didn't have anything other than rocks to clean my fish on, which meant any time my knife, kind of went out and touched something, it was getting dull. So to have a wooden board to clean on actually, really saved the life of my knife quite a bit. I did have a sharpening stone that I'd come up with, and I was able to get my knife crazy freaking sharp after stropping it off of my belt and using that stone. But it was a lot of work to do that, and it was better to just keep it sharp in the first place. I also took the guts from that female lake trout and cut them into sections just long enough to tie knots in, and I tied knots of her intestines into the fish net, into the gill net, so that the scent of fish would be in the water, hopefully attracting pike or burbot or other animals that are a little bit more, aggressive or scavenger-like. And so that was another thing that I had done. It's also the first, me putting the net back out there is the first time they show me being lightheaded. And I was very lightheaded. By that point in the game, only 2 weeks in, if I stood up, I was ready to fall down right away. I was seeing stars, all that stuff. My body required